Interested in all things psychology? You are at the right place. Here, we bring exciting and thought-provoking ideas. We travel into our minds and some things out of this world. Welcome to the Psychology Debrief.
Hello and welcome to the Psychology Debrief. I'm your host, Sam Fairlamb, and today we are talking about maintaining motivation in education. I'm joined by, first of all, Professor Victoria Bourne. Victoria works on our statistics module here at Royal Holloway, but she also does research looking at statistics anxiety. I'm also joined by Dr. Ilham Sebah. Ilham does work on resilience and specifically how that relates to well-being. And very finally, I'm joined by one of our PhD candidates, Aysha Bellamy. Aysha has previously worked on research projects looking at student engagement in Leeds University, I believe, if that's correct. Thank you all for joining me.
Lincoln, but
Lincoln,
yeah,
sorry.
enough. Yeah, remember now. You're close.
Yeah, I got one letter right. That's pretty good in my book. So I thought, first of all, it's probably quite useful just to kind of mention that I think, motivation is something, that goes beyond necessarily higher education itself. I think that, we all at some point in our lives struggle with motivation, even, in the jobs that we do. Sometimes it's very difficult just to kind of keep going at things and plugging away at things. So I think it's a very natural sort of problem that we face as humans, but obviously for students, it can be a tremendous problem to maintain motivation over the course of 3 years if you're doing a kind of standard undergraduate degree, but there are obviously various other types of degrees. And I thought maybe first of all, to kind of get started on this topic, would be maybe to just discuss how, when students move from sort of lower education, when they finish their A-levels and GCSEs and then moving to higher education, how vastly different that can be. And I think it can be a little bit of a kind of culture shock for some students about how tremendously different it is. So I didn't know if any of you wanted just to talk a little bit about some of the differences that there might exist between lower and higher education and therefore how that might make it difficult for students to kind of find the motivation to kind of persist with their studies.
So I'm happy to kick off. So I think one of the I think there's two key differences, one being the kind of level of independence that students are expected to show. But here there is definitely a balance. And I think this is something that you sort of you really learn in your first year. It's kind of taking that step up to become more independent, but also within that, still keeping an eye on what the assessment aims are and what the learning outcomes of the module are. So, you do need to be independent, but you also need to be very aware of the kind of limitations that bound that independence, and getting that balance right, I think is a real skill that's developed in the first year of the degree. And then I think the second thing is that move towards more critical thinking and really getting an understanding of what does critical thinking actually mean, and how do you develop those skills. It's a skill that has to be developed. It isn't something you just switch on suddenly. So how do you develop those skills? How do you demonstrate them? How do you apply them? So I think those are two of the key big issues. And I really think it's important that they're not things that you're expected to suddenly just have. They're things that we help you to develop through the first year of your degree.
Right, and obviously with critical thinking, it's one of those things where I guess sometimes we lament that maybe students don't get enough experience at lower education, kind of developing those skills. So they come here, not necessarily to this institution, but to higher education in general. And then, are asked to start doing things that they haven't kind of commonly done before. And that's difficult. And, and when, generally speaking, when we come up against a challenge which is tough, we can then struggle to kind of, keep up in the face of that kind of adversity. But you did mention, obviously, Victoria, that, whilst obviously we expect, our students over the course of a degree to achieve those things, that eventually you will start to be able to critically think and obviously be independent, that to some degree, it's not necessarily just throwing them in at the deep end and then going, let's see who swims and let's see who doesn't. But, there's kind of support, particularly early in the degree, to try and get them, embedded in a higher education culture. Is that correct?
Yeah, and I think they're definitely academic skills. And we talk about academic skills, and I think we often think about writing and referencing. But actually, I think that kind of getting that balance of independence, thinking about the critical thinking. And I think with A-levels, often the critical thinking that there is very structured. It's very kind of, you hit on these points, here are the things you can be critical about. And one of the things that I think we do in higher education is start to take that structure away and allow people to have a bit more freedom in what they're critically thinking about, which again, it takes a bit of practice and it takes a lot more confidence to do that. And that's where I think it kind of has the link into motivation is, you know, if you try something out in first year and it doesn't quite work out, that can really dent your confidence, and then you don't want to try it again. So having the kind of structured experience, that sort of scaffolded stepping into becoming more independent, into being up to demonstrating critical thinking, and having that structured and supported, as well as getting the kind of critical feedback if you do go wrong. You need to know if you're doing something in a way that's not right. So it's getting that balance right, as particularly through first year.
Yeah, and of course, when you mention independence, obviously the thing that comes to my mind is this issue with a lot of what you will be doing in the degree is outside of the classroom. I mean, you have your lecture, sure, but you know, outside of that, you then need to go, you know, and do, say, you know, for example, readings, or you know, do these assessments and so forth. And so a lot of it has to come from your own impetus. There's not, you know, at lower education, I remember, and it's now starting to be something which is unfortunately a long time ago. It didn't seem that long ago, but now as I feel I'm getting very older, it was, you know, a very long time ago when I was actually in
yourself.
I didn't want to remind anyone of their timely age, but there we are. The point is, though, you know, is that when you're in lower education, you know, you have all these classes back to back. You have a teacher there all the time that's kind of, I guess, a bit of a stick, really, to make sure you're kind of doing the work, but that doesn't really exist at higher education. So I guess my question is, you know, how can maybe a student adapt or find ways to kind of get used to that, where, you know, they have to be in their own home or their halls or go to the library and just kind of get on with some of the work that's been set for them without necessarily us being there, you know, telling them, have you read this, have you done this, have you done that? Yeah,
I mean, I think with A levels, you've got a very strict timetable, everything's very structured. You have to, you know, each week say what you've done, and lots of that infrastructure is not there for degrees. And I think, again, this is almost like developing an academic skill. And I think a lot of what students need to do in their first year is almost getting to know themselves really well and what works for them. And, you know, one of the reasons that a strict timetable and lots of structure won't work is that people work differently and people have different lives as well. And I think one of the things that can be quite challenging, but also can be the most effective thing when you're learning how to study, is learning how you work. When do you work best? How do you work best? Practicing different ways of doing things, so that then sort of by the time you get to the end of your first year and you go into your second year, you've really got that kind of working pattern really well established, and you know what you're good at, you know what you need a bit more time or support in doing, and that's when you can really kind of excel and do your best in your studies.
Yeah, if I could just jump in there, I think that's a really good point from Victoria there. That was really amazing, actually. And I just wanted to echo that, you know, just because you're doing a degree, you are not the finished product. Like, even now I'm doing a PhD, I'm not the finished product. You know what I mean? You are refining your skills. You're basically in a 3-year training program, right? So, you know, you don't have to be perfect at everything. And actually, I think it takes a really strong person to admit what they don't know and what areas they struggle with, because we all have areas that we struggle with, right? I mean, for me, I actually was really worried about stats at the beginning of my degree, and then I ended up quite liking stats. And it was actually the module that threw me was sleep in my undergrad. You know, it was like, sleep is something that I do not need to understand why or how. And, you know, I barely scraped a pass on that module. And, you know, it's okay to admit there are modules like that just throw us and we just don't relate to. And I guess, I think for me as well, part of that is that critical thinking doesn't just happen in the library or when you're with a book, right? Sometimes the best thoughts I've ever had are just when I like casually talk to other psychology students or just other students in general about these things. And, you know, we start to have a bit of a debate, like, well, I thought this, and it's like, no, well, I see that, but I also thought this. And, you know, those kind of like casual little debates that you have, in a way, they are the best form of critical thinking, because you're getting to express your opinions and your academic stance in your own language.
Yeah, you know, I think that's a really good point, that sometimes a lot of, you know, the kind of key things that you end up learning are not necessarily just in that classroom. One of the other problems that I think may also exist when we talk about maintaining motivation in education is that often students come from, well, I mean, various different backgrounds, but may often have been used to, I mean, particularly in this institution with the kind of students that end up coming here, achieving very, very highly and maybe being top or near top of their class. And then they come to an institution like this where there's maybe 300-400 of them. And suddenly it's like being in a completely different pond where, you may come across not so superstar as you did in your kind of smaller education setting. So I kind of wonder whether, I don't know if any of you are familiar with sort of work or research in that kind of area about, sort of this kind of sense of feeling like we're not superstars and so forth. And I guess the issue of how we can manage expectations when you kind of come into education at the higher level.
Yes, I think there's almost like two elements here. One is kind of how what you achieve differs in comparison to your peers. So, you're right, up until A levels, you're often in quite a small class and you might be the top of the class and frequently getting A's and B's and doing really, really well. And then you come from a relatively small class into a far bigger group of people who have all been the person you were in your smaller class. And that can really change things in terms of how you feel within your peer group, because you can go from being top performing to being kind of quite average. And that can be quite a big shift in how you see yourself. And I think that can sometimes really dent the self-esteem and the motivation. Whereas actually what you should try to be framing it as is, look, we've all achieved so much. We're all doing really well, which has allowed us all to get here. So it's not that being in that different group makes you any less. It means everybody's done really, really well. The other thing that I think is, sorry, go on there, Aysha.
I was just going to say, I 100% agree with that. I sort of was in that position because I came from, I guess, a less selective school. Like, it was just a community college that I came from. Not many people went to uni. So I definitely came from that big fish, small pond to medium fish, very big sea. And actually, I loved it because for the first time, I felt like I fit in. You know what I mean? Like, I felt like, oh, these are my people. And I guess, like you said, you always have that voice in your head that's comparing yourself to others, but then it's your personal choice how much you listen to that voice. And for me, I was like, I'm going to try hard never to be that competitive person that tries to put other people down. Like, at the end of the day, like you said, we're all amazing for getting onto this degree. And, all these people are potential candidates to be friends as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
Sorry, I interrupted you.
So no, I think that change keeps on going as well. So, once you finish your degree, if you then go on to postgraduate study, again, that pool size changes. And so I just think it's really important to be kind of aware of that and mindful of that. I think lots of people don't necessarily think about that when they go into their degree, and then it can be quite a shock. The other second thing, I'll be really quick, is I think you're quite often used to being very high performing. And so then when you come into a degree and those standards increase and the academic skills are really different, that can change the profile of marks that you're used to. And if you're very, very used to always being top of the class, always doing well, when you at some point get a mark on an essay or a lab report that is lower than sort of a really, really good one, it can really knock your confidence because you're not used to that. And you haven't kind of built up those resilience skills to kind of cope with that feedback and that lower mark, and that can really, really throw people. So I think there's those two different elements, but I think just being aware of that before you come into a degree can be incredibly valuable.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's kind of two sort of issues here, where one is, there's this issue where as humans we make these social comparisons all the time, right? It's natural to compare yourself to others. And often, I guess for a student, when you come to higher education, the most obvious comparison is your peer, right? And the people that you're doing the degree alongside. But as you move up to further levels of education, obviously you're going to come across more and more talented students just like yourself. That means that you're going to become more or feel more and more like you're average or potentially inadequate. Yet, it's kind of really the other comparison you should be making is to kind of maybe, I guess, more broader society. I mean, lots of people don't come to higher education, for example, and that's probably a better kind of comparison to make. But obviously the other problem is, as you kind of noted, Victoria, is that as you move up the higher levels of education, the standards of what we expect are going to increase. And so it's not it's not necessarily a bad thing to kind of move slightly further down the scale. I mean, I guess lots of students get used to this kind of, you know, you get A's or A stars. I can't remember what the equivalent is nowadays. They've changed it to 1s and 2s, but you know, I come from the olden times where A's and stuff was the way things go. But it sometimes seems to me as if, like, you know, when a student gets a 62, there's nothing wrong with 62. 62 is good. You know, at least that's where I came from back in my day. A 62 was nothing to kind of go and disembowel yourself over. It was a perfectly good grade, and I think it evinces this issue that there's these unrealistic expectations sometimes that students have when they come in.
I'm just going to quickly say, like, what you said there, Sam, about the 62, it's a really good example of the attainment gap. And when we talk about the attainment gap, it's not, you know, all the people that are failing or getting thirds. It's just the people who are not getting the grades that they want. So if you've got these straight A's, you know, you come with this expectation, I'm going to be a first class student. To then receive that 62, to you, that is the, you know, attainment gap. And it's when, you know, your grades don't align with what you expect of yourself. That's when the expectations of what you achieve will be violated. And that's when your motivation can really take a massive hit.
I was just going to add, just in terms of managing expectations and things to, I guess, expect once you enter university is the idea of being uncomfortable. So I know from my experience of being at university, especially coming from A-levels, I didn't expect to be pushed outside of my comfort zone as much as I did. And linked to that is this constant juggling act that you do, because you're suddenly having to learn, you know, several modules at the same time. You have to manage a number of, you know, assessments going on at the same time. And that's something that I guess first year university students are not necessarily used to. There's definitely less spoon feeding going on and hand holding. So I think in terms of managing expectations and coming from being, you know, the top student to feeling quite average is this sense of being pushed out of your comfort zone. And personally, I quite like that. And I quite like that about being in university. Is even at, you know, the stage that I'm at is I constantly feel like, you know, I'm on my toes, and that's quite challenging. And that's what keeps me motivated.
And I think that idea of, you know, kind of getting outside your comfort zone is a really kind of good point that I think links to what I wanted to kind of ask next, which is, you know, often in education, you know, parts of it is going to be difficult. I mean, that's what education is about, right? It's not meant to be easy, although parts of it will certainly be more difficult to you than others. I mean, personally, just neuroscience was just something that just never worked for me. You know, but other parts of psychology I understood a lot better. You know, and I think that for a student, it's natural then to shy away from the parts where you don't do so well, right? And I think I agree with you, Illy, that I think one of the most important things with learning is just to kind of go, you know what, go with the things that I struggle with the most. That's going to be the clear benefit. Get outside your comfort zone. I don't know, maybe it's why I've chosen to do this, because, you know, it means that I'm learning new skills and trying to host things and stuff. But I guess, Victoria, you do work on sort of statistics anxiety and children's sort of students' attitudes towards statistics. And I know typically that's the kind of part of the degree where they sort of struggle the most. And I'm wondering how, you know, what is the research that there suggests, and how do you deal with that in your own teaching? How do you make it easier for students in that regard?
I mean, it's a really multifaceted and really interesting question. I mean, one of the things about doing a psychology degree in the UK is they're BPS accredited, British Psychological Society accredited. And part of that accreditation means that every psychology degree has to have a research methods and statistics component. So there's kind of no getting away from it. You have to do it if you're going to do a psychology degree. And that doesn't necessarily mean that all students either A, are aware of it, or B, want to do it. So I think one of the things that's really important at the beginning of first year in terms of the way I approach the teaching and the structure of the course is to try and take a step back from the statistics at first and instead talk far more about what's the value of research in psychology. Why do we do research? What's the point of it? What's the function of it within psychology? Well, that's the basis of everything we know. We know stuff about psychology because we've done research. So to do the exciting stuff in psychology, we have to be researchers. And one part of that is to do stats to find out whether, you know, our studies worked out or not. So we're going to do a bit of stats, but essentially what we're focusing on is how do we become researchers so that we can make more of psychology and understand more of how we think, feel and behave. And by framing it that way around, it gives far more context to the statistics and gives a reason for doing it, rather than kind of, I think sometimes the temptation can be isolate statistics because students hate it. And if you map it onto anything else, it'll have a sort of bleed over effect that they hate everything statistics touches. But actually, the more you embed statistics, the better, because then you know what's the point. And I think that's one of the difficult things with undergraduates is kind of, what's the point of doing it? Why do I need to look at this equation? I don't care about that. I want to understand about clinical psychology and child development and interactions between people. That's what I care about. I don't care about a t-test. So trying to kind of give that context, I think, is the most important thing at the very beginning of the degree. And if students understand why we're getting them to do statistics, then I think it's far easier to then kind of convert them to love statistics. I didn't start my degree liking statistics at all. My entire career now is statistics, right? And I love it and I'm really passionate about it, but I didn't start my degree like that. I actually started doing maths A-level and dropped out of it at the end of my first year. I hated it. I was rubbish at it. I am not a natural mathematician. So then when I started my degree, I thought I was going to be all about the clinical and all about the social. And by the end of my first year, I realized that I was horrific at both of those things. And actually my natural skills were more around the kind of cognitive, individual differences and statistics, funnily enough. So, you know, it's a bit like we were talking about earlier on, getting to understand yourself and sometimes putting those preconceptions behind you. You know, I had such clear vision of I'm going to be all about social and clinical. And I had to completely reframe how I saw myself as a kind of psychology student in my first year. And once I kind of got my head around that, I actually found it far easier to progress through. And then I kind of embraced the statistics. And now that's what I do. So I think that context and that understanding of who you are as a person and how that maps onto what you're learning is really important.
And
I 1000% agree. Sorry, I just wanted to quickly jump in on there. I 1000% agree with everything. I was exactly the same. But also, if by the end of first year you haven't found your thing yet, that's also okay. Because a lot of the time we don't offer the modules until second or third year where you really get to shine. So yeah, I figured out on third year I loved evolution and I was going to stay in evolutionary psychology. But before I could take that, you know, it was like, okay, I'm fairly good at stats, but I'm not clinical, I'm not social, don't know what I am yet, but it will come to me.
Yeah, and just again, on the back of that, that also links to the whole managing expectations, to go back to the original question, because I often hear students say, particularly in their first year, you know, this doesn't really feel like I'm learning about psychology. And I always say to them, just stick it out, because it gets a lot more interesting, particularly in your second and third year, where you get a lot more choice and you get to learn about the subjects that you're really fascinated with. So yeah. Yeah,
I think in first year we're really giving those strong foundations, and those strong foundations might not be the really exciting bit of it.
Exactly.
But you need those strong foundations so that you can build that massive exciting roller coaster on top of it, otherwise everything falls down. So I completely agree with you. First year is very foundational, and sometimes that doesn't really do it for students quite so much, but you need that so that you can then go on to do the really exciting stuff later.
And I'm just wondering, just a question to all of you, is there sort of one way that you might try and, you know, if you have students who maybe are a bit anxious or concerned about learning the kind of things that you teach, how do you address that in your teaching? Is there anything that you often try and do to try and make it maybe easier or more engaging, so that, you know, students who are maybe struggling a little bit with being concerned about that sort of area of learning, is there anything particularly that you often try and do within your teaching to make it engaging or overcome those issues with motivation?
I talk about cake quite a lot. Don't know if that helps.
I don't know whether that's just because you have sort of...
Oh, Victoria, I'd love to sit in on your lectures, Victoria.
It's all cake and chocolate. But on a serious note, I think possibly one of the things, you know, particularly because I teach statistics quite a lot, it's trying to create an environment where students feel really comfortable saying to you, I don't get it. What you just said makes no sense. And creating an environment, you know, particularly in a large lecture hall where you can have like 300 students, where somebody actually feels comfortable saying, can you just go over that again? Because I didn't follow that at all. So I think, you know, giving plenty of stop points where you can sort of say, you know, how's this going? And framing the question or as, am I making any sense, rather than do you understand me? So it makes it more about, you know, am I explaining this clearly enough, rather than is this your problem? So, you know, am I making sense? You know, is everyone okay? But also in the way you sort of answer questions, and, you know, sometimes students will ask questions that you'd never expect, and being able to turn around at that point and say, I don't know the answer to your question. That is an amazing question, and in my entire career I've never thought about that. So, you know, give me a second to think about it, or I'm going to go away and look something up and I'll get back to you later on. And being sort of open to that idea that, you know, it's not just them learning. I'm kind of, every lecture I give, I'm learning a little bit more, whether it's about stats or whether it's about the way I teach. So I think creating that environment where people feel able and confident to say, I'm not following you, can you go through that again? I think that's probably the most valuable thing for me.
Yeah, I completely agree, Victoria. And I think that's so difficult for first year students, because they often feel like they're the only ones who don't get it. And when you're sat in a lecture with 300 students, you don't want to be the only one to put your hand up. So one of the things that I have done in my lectures is I'll introduce an anonymous poll where students can sort of text in if they have a question or if they don't understand, and that way they're not, you know, outing themselves. So that's worked quite well.
But it's not even that, you know, I think that's a great idea, but, you know, I think it's cliche, but there's value in saying, you know, there's no such thing as a stupid question. And if there is, then, you know, I'm immensely stupid then, I guess. But, you know, I think that even if you are maybe a bit concerned, you know, about the question you're asking, it really isn't anything to be ashamed of to have a question or not understand something straight away. And if you don't want to ask in a lecture, fine, you know, you can go to, you know, your sort of lecturers drop-in sessions, which all universities tend to have, where then you can ask them, you know, in a face-to-face where none of the other peers are necessarily going to know. But I think it's important.
Yeah.
You know,
but I think that takes confidence, because I think in your first year, and I know for myself personally, in my first year, I didn't feel confident enough to say, actually, I don't quite understand that. And from showing students that they are literally not the only ones that don't know what's going on, that I think boosts their confidence to be able to say, yeah, me too.
Yeah, no, definitely. So let's move on, because I appreciate that we're running out of time. So I just wanted to quickly bring up the issue, obviously, of burnout. So this is obviously the concept that over the course of time, you know, when you're doing the same thing repeatedly, which, you know, students might be the case of, you know, you're writing an essay, getting feedback, essay feedback, and so forth, going to lectures continuously, that you can just kind of get fatigued and feel burnt out. I don't know whether there are things that, I know, Victoria, obviously some of our viewers may not know, but you kind of oversee the way in which our whole year is designed, and obviously, you know, when assessments occur in the year. Does this kind of play a factor in the way that you kind of try and design the curriculum and the way in which, you know, you kind of offer the assessments over the course of the year?
Absolutely, and I think that one of the things that's really important is to try and look at it almost from different levels. So sort of, if you're looking from the student perspective, how does your week go? When are your lectures? When are the deadlines? When are all those different things going to happen? When do you have a chunk of time where you can do all of your reading or writing for your assessments? So how does your week work? How does the academic year work in terms of the pacing of the assessments and having time to revise for your exams and structuring that? And then how does it work across your entire degree? So what are the things and the skills that you're learning in first year, that foundation that we were just talking about? How do you create that solid foundation? So then when they move into second year, you're kind of able to apply those skills in a slightly more exciting way. And then in third year, when you're becoming more independent and you're picking options that are kind of within your area of interest, like Aysha was saying, meeting environmental evolutionary psychology at the end of your degree, you know, how does it change as you go through your degree? So I think looking at it at all those different levels and trying to balance things out so that, you know, things progress okay. But it doesn't matter how well you balance those things, there are always going to be pinch points in the year. And I think, again, that's something that's really important to acknowledge and understand. And one of the times that I think is always challenging is the end of term 2. At the end of term 2, everyone is wrecked, right? Everybody is getting to the point where they're just like, I need a break. I need the Easter break. I need some time off, because you've had all of term 1, the Christmas break is quite short, you're into term 2, you've done loads of assessments, and always at the end of term 2, everyone is ready for a break. And to some extent, just kind of knowing that, I think is really valuable, because I think often people, when they're starting to get to that burnout point, don't share it.
Yeah.
And don't talk about it. And I think it's really important to talk about the fact that that's a pinch point in the year. You know, misery loves company sometimes, you know, having that ability to turn and say, yeah, I'm wrecked too, I can't wait, I need to get through the next week so that then I can take a week off. And so I think there's lots of different levels, but also being open about it is really important.
Yeah, I think as well, like just jumping on that, an important thing there, like Victoria's just saying, is like admitting when you need to take a break, and also like pacing yourself and giving yourself rewards. I remember when I was in first year and really worried about stats, my stats lecture was actually timetabled to be the last thing on a Tuesday afternoon. And then we had, so when I was younger, Tuesday night was the going out night. So I always knew there'd be some sort of party or pre-drinks I could go to at 9. And it gave me this few-hour gap where I would actually go sit in the library or, you know, at halls if it was quiet. And I just say to myself, like, right, you have to learn one thing. You know, just one thing from this lecture you actually understand. Find it, you know, work through some examples in your head and just really consolidate that. And when I learned one thing, I then, you know, packed the books away and went to find that party. And it's almost like doing that, it made it my reward for myself. And it really helped me to actually learn stats and feel more confident with it, because I knew I'd get the reward afterwards.
And I think that's a really good point about this kind of idea of just, you know, just sit down and just learn one thing. I think sometimes I find it even just in my own job, just, you know, sometimes you don't have the kind of resources and capacity on a certain day just to kind of do the things you need to do, but just tackle something, you know, whatever you think is easiest at that point for you, at least you're going to make progress. And I often find actually that once I then sit down and do something which wasn't too bad, I then kind of find actually, it's like, you know, when you, the whole idea of exercise, it's like terrible for like the first 10 minutes, but then you kind of like, actually, this is not so bad and I can just keep going for longer and longer. And I think sometimes that's the case with sort of learning as well. It's the first bit is really tough every day. It's like sitting down and reading a paper or looking at a lecture or something. But once you kind of get over that hurdle, it then becomes a bit easier. So I think that's a really nice point, Aysha. Very finally,
sorry, Sam, can I just add a final point to that, actually, just linking it to the theme of today's podcast, is this idea of actually motivation is a little bit of a myth, because you're never really going to be motivated to pick up a textbook and learn about something quite difficult. So I think you're completely right in saying just do that one thing, and then that one thing can lead to covering, you know, another module, or actually making a start with that essay that's due in a couple of weeks' time. So I think just sitting there and waiting to be motivated, I feel like you're going to be sitting there for a really long time.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a really good point. And I just wanted to finish, you know, with your work area on resilience. So I thought maybe first of all, you could just explain what resilience precisely is, and then maybe how sort of resilience can kind of I guess we've been really sort of talking a little bit about it kind of throughout implicitly this whole topic. So, you know, if you have any kind of top tips as to, you know, ways in which students might be able to build resilience to kind of face these challenges in higher education.
Sure. So I think a really popular way of viewing what resilience is this idea of bouncing back from difficulties or, you know, stressful experiences. But I personally like the idea of bouncing forward, which is quite different from bouncing back. So bouncing back is the idea that, you know, you're operating on a particular baseline level. You go through some sort of challenge, you develop your resilience skills in order to get back to that baseline level of operating. Whereas bouncing forward means, because you've developed these resilience strategies, you're no longer operating from your starting point, but actually you're better equipped for future challenges. So in terms of some of the tips, I'm going to try and link it to some of the topics that we've covered. So for instance, when you do receive a grade or, you know, feedback on a piece of coursework where you haven't done so well, how do you manage those feelings? So failure, unfortunately, is inevitable. It's a normal human experience. And I know that you've covered this in a previous podcast episode. So, you know, one of the things I always say is it's unrealistic to think that you're not going to feel sad. You're not going to feel quite angry or feel like you've let yourself and others down. But how do you deal with those, you know, really difficult emotions? And one of the strategies is to reframe your relationship or what you think about failure. So I guess I won't go too into it because you have covered this in a previous episode. So in terms of the feedback you receive, have a look at the feedback. and sit there and ask yourself, what can I learn from this? You know, this is an opportunity for me to grow as a person. This is something that's knocked my confidence. It's, you know, it's definitely not what I expected. I've put everything into this and I've just barely scraped a pass. So I think at university, there's a lot of, there's going to be a number of uncomfortable experiences, I guess. And one of the ideas that I really like is it's not so much what you get, but the person that you become. And I feel like failure is a fantastic opportunity for you to really learn about your weaknesses. And the other thing was about just linking it to burnout is some of the kind of physical symptoms that we experience. So cognitively, we know that, you know, there are going to be times where we're stressed, definitely at university. We might go through challenges in and outside of university, but that also can take its physical toll. So in terms of learning to be resilient, it's not just, you know, dealing with what's up here in your mind, but also physically. And I really like what Victoria said about everybody's quite different in terms of how they learn. And this also goes for resilience. So I think it's, you know, to say, you know, you should do this because this works for me, it may not work for you. So one of the things I really love about teaching resilience is I get to teach students about a number of strategies, and they can dip in and out of these strategies as and when they need it. So one of the things that I teach, for example, is about mindfulness meditation, breathing techniques, relaxation techniques, and that may or may not work for some of the students. And then we also talk about physical exercise or dance or movement or something to just get your body, you know, moving. And I quite like that because students can then think, oh, well, I've got this toolkit, you know, full of strategies, and I don't necessarily have to implement them every single day, but I can just dip in and out as and when I need it. So yeah, those are really two quick tips that I have.
Yeah. And just jumping on that exercise thing, it's worth pointing out that all universities have sports and societies. So, you know, you don't have to exercise alone. You can even use that as a way to make friends and let off steam.
Yeah, I think one other thing just to add into that, I was talking about feedback, is I think another way to think about feedback is I think sometimes it's easy to view feedback, you know, you submit your assignment and that is the end of the learning process, like that's the accumulation of the whole thing. And actually the learning process continues after that. So when you get your feedback, that's still part of the learning process. That's still when you're learning about this topic itself, but also when you're learning particularly about your strengths and your weaknesses and how you work as a student. And it continues even past then and how you apply that into other modules. So I think rather than treating learning as little chunks that finish when you submit your assessment, thinking about it as something that you start at the beginning of your degree and you kind of get to a sort of end point when you graduate, but you're probably still going to carry on past then. So trying to not think about sort of the assessment as a really fundamental end point, but just as a waypoint in that whole process, I think can be helpful as well.
I mean, I get the sense that we could probably go on forever about this topic, but we are actually out of time, though we do have a little bit of time left for a quiz, if that's okay. And maybe after this, maybe we can have a part 2 of maintaining motivation in education and have you guys back. So today's quiz is on famous psychology studies. Now, I've got a series of papers that I found online via Google Scholar, and I found out how many times the paper had been cited. So your role is I'm going to give you 2 papers, and you're going to have to guess which one you think has been more impactful, and I'm defining impactful there by the number of citations. So the first one is Gibson and Walk 1960, The Visual Cliff. And the other one is Simons and I believe it's pronounced Shabry, 1999, Gorillas in Our Midst, Sustained Inattentional Blindness for Dynamic Events. Do we know what those 2 papers are referring to?
I think I did them both as undergrad.
They are very famous experiments and studies, so I don't know if anyone wants to say which ones which are.
I think the visual cliff, is that the one with babies, and because they're meant to have instinctive fear of heights, if you put a see-through glass panel so they're actually crawling but they think they're going to fall, they won't go over that unless they see their mother at the other end. Yeah.
And what about the Simons and Shabry? Did anyone pick up the clue in the title?
Is that the basketball?
Yeah, I was going to say.
Yeah, so it's the one where people don't often tend to notice the gorilla that's walking across the stage.
Yeah.
To count the number of times the basketball's going around. It's a really clever sort of paradigm. So which one do you think has been cited more? Do you think it's the 1960 paper on the visual cliff or the 1999 paper on the gorilla experiment?
I think it might be gorilla. So I just feel like that's everywhere. You know, it's all over undergrad degrees as well. Probably not the best way to measure impact, I guess. But yeah, no, I think I'd say gorilla. I'm probably wrong.
I was originally going to go for the gorilla one, but then, I mean, listening to what you said earlier, Sam, about the Milgram paper not being cited as much, and then that's quite everywhere as well. So I'm going to go for the visual cliff one.
Okay.
I'm going to go for the visual cliff one, just purely in terms of publication dates. That's had a lot more time to accumulate. So if you're doing citations per year, I'd go for the Simons paper, but total, I'm going to go for the visual cliff.
We've already had a previous conversation about whether citations per year is a better measure than numbers.
Yeah.
Honestly, the level of quizzes that I put together are not that robust. So this was actually a fairly trick one. So if you use the general heuristic of older is equals more citations, then you are actually wrong. So Gibson and Walk had 1,258 citations, which is a pretty good number. Simons and Chabry have surprisingly, over the course of only, what is it, about 20 years or so, 3,570.
Wow.
That's a fairly well done them for citation. Yeah. Victoria, it might be the most heavily cited paper.
That's impressive.
That is impressive. Yeah. Okay, so the next one, keep the Simons and Chabry one in mind, 3,578. Do you think this one was higher or lower? This is Tajfel. Experiments in intergroup discrimination. Now, do you know which one that is?
Oh, is this the minimal group study where they're like flip a coin or do you like this painting? They're the most silliest definitions of a group, and yet you still get that out-group discrimination where you'd rather give money to an in-group member. You don't want to give anything nice to the, Yeah, so there's lots of variations of it, but you've mentioned a few. So essentially, participants are allocated on arbitrary criteria like a coin toss, so your heads group or tails group. And people still display biases towards their own group, despite the fact that it would be meaningless, trivial criteria to have been allocated on. So, do you think that was cited more or less than the gorilla in our midst?
I'm going to go for less.
Okay, less.
It's a difficult one. I know recently there's been a lot of stuff about trying to replicate him. So I think like just purely because of all the replications, maybe it's now more. I might be overanalyzing.
Yeah, I reckon more.
So this one was close, and it is just fractionally more. So it's 3,652, but obviously, technically, Simons and Chabry would be winning on citations per year. Okay, so I can't remember who's winning, but well done to whoever's winning so far. So keep in mind, Tajfel is now our leader at 3,652. The next experiment I have is Festinger and Carl Smith, Cognitive Consequences of Forced Compliance. This was in 1959.
I'm going to say less just because all three of us were like, what? Who?
Yeah. The name does ring a bell, but I just can't remember the actual experiment.
So if I told you it was an experiment where essentially participants had to do a really boring task for about 2 hours, and then were told they had to go and tell another participant about what the study was about and how amazing it was, and they were either paid $1 or $20.
Oh, yes.
You know what this is about?
Yeah.
So it's about cognitive dissonance. So those who were given only $1 incentive actually in the end rated the experiment as really interesting because they were told to do it. Whereas obviously those who were given $20 had that, well, I was given $20 to lie, so why not? I didn't really find it interesting. So it was an example of cognitive dissonance, very, very classic study. So I think, which one of you went lower?
I'm going to stick with lower.
Anyone want to go higher?
Yeah, I'm going to say higher.
Okay.
I'm going to go lower.
It is indeed higher, 4,933.
Wow.
Now, cognitive dissonance theory is absolutely massive. So I think the clue there might have been, obviously, it's really a fundamental study in that area of psychology.
It's a good example as well. I never got it as an undergrad. So another example of you don't have to be good at everything. I even deleted the study from my brain. That's how much I didn't get it.
I mean, it's amazing how, like, you know, as you go on, you kind of become much more narrow in what you learn, and so there's lots of psychology I expunged from my memory too. Okay, very finally, is this one-sided more or less than the cognitive consequences of forced compliance? So this one is Baron Cohen, Leslie and Frith, 1985. Does the autistic child have a theory of mind? I think it's probably that some of you may know this answer or not, but I don't know.
It's everywhere, isn't it? As soon as you said the name, I knew who it was about hearing the title. Like, that's how big it is. So I want to say more, but I also am aware it could be a trick question. But I'll
I'm exactly the same.
So more, Aysha. What about Illy and Victoria?
I had exactly the same thought as Aysha. My initial instinct was more, but I think this is a trick question.
Yeah.
You think I'm tricking you? Is that the case?
Yeah.
I would never. I did think earlier to that. Illy, are you also going?
I thought exactly the same thing. So I'm actually going to go less, only because I think it's a trick question as well.
Absolutely no faith in me. A staggering 11,200.
Wow.
I think almost about all of those combined. So well done, folks, for coming up with a very, very highly important paper. We forgot to mention what the paper actually is. It's I think it's called the Sally Ann task. Is that the name of the So it's how you can sort of do an example of whether somebody has a theory of mind by knowing where to look for the doll, or where the other person would look for the doll rather. Okay, I don't know who won that, but let's just say you're all winners. I think it's a quiz where the points don't matter. Anyway, thanks very much for taking part, and hopefully I'll see you guys again soon.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sam. Thanks, everyone.
We enjoyed it.
Bye.
Yeah.
Thank you for watching the Psychology Debrief. If you have any suggestions for new topics, quizzes, or any other content psychology related, feel free to get in touch via email or Twitter. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Bye!